The courtroom was unusually crowded for a Monday morning. Rows of stiff wooden benches were filled with reporters, attorneys, social workers, and curious onlookers. The air was heavy with anticipation as the door at the back slowly opened. Emily. Harper stepped in, eyes wide, heart pounding. Clutched tightly in her hand was the leash of her golden retriever. Samson, a large, calm dog whose eyes scanned the room like he knew exactly why they were there, not just 17. Emily looked young or fragile. Even, but there was something determined about her. Her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a hard line. Every step she took toward the witness stand felt like walking through quicksand, but Samson kept her grounded. Each movement of his paws was deliberate, like he'd done this before. The bailiff gave her a brief nod and motioned to the stand. As Emily sat down, Samson curled at her feet, close enough to touch, close enough to protect. This was no ordinary court case. Emily's stepfather, Robert Langston, was on trial for years of abuse that had been hidden behind the walls of their quiet suburban home. The case had made headlines, not only because of the disturbing details, but because of Emily's refusal to stay silent. She was the one who had finally called it in. She was the one who had agreed to testify. And she was the one who had insisted her dog be allowed in the courtroom. The judge had originally hesitated. Emotional support animals in criminal trials weren't the norm. But after reviewing the documentation provided by her therapist and trauma recovery team, he'd granted special permission. Samson was no ordinary pet. He had been trained by a nonprofit that specialized in placing PTSD service dogs with survivors of violence. His role wasn't just emotional. He could detect stress responses, interrupt panic attacks, and if needed, step between his handler and a perceived threat. Emily's eyes shifted toward the defense table. Her stepfather was there, wearing a dark suit and his usual smug expression. His lips twitched in a small smirk when their eyes met. She froze. That same look, the one he used to give her before hurting her, made her chest tighten. Samson stirred, taking a shallow breath. Emily looked down and touched 2 fingers softly against her jeans, just above her knee dot. It was the signal. Samson immediately lifted his head. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. But his entire body became alert. With quiet, precise movements, he stood up and placed himself between Emily and the defense table. His posture was calm but firm, as though drawing a line no one would dare cross. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom. Like falling leaves. The judge leaned forward from the bench, his eyebrows furrowed. Is the dog responding to something? The prosecutor stood, unsure whether to speak. Emily's lawyer looked startled, but Emily, trembling, nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, she said, voice soft but steady. I gave him a signal. He's trained to protect me when I'm afraid. Her voice quivered on the last word. Across the room, her stepfather scoffed under his breath, but the judge held up a hand. I'd like the courtroom cleared, he said calmly. The room stirred with murmurs. The judge repeated the order firmer this time, and people began rising and filing out, including the jury. Only Emily, her attorney Samson, and the judge remained. Even the defense was asked to step outside. Miss Harper, the judge said gently, I want to understand exactly what's happening here. Emily looked down at Samson, who now sat perfectly still between her and the space her abuser had occupied. And for the first time since walking into the courtroom, she felt safe. The silence was powerful, charged, not empty. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was something deeper. Something the world needed to hear. Emily sat quietly as the courtroom emptied, the sounds of footsteps and murmured voices fading behind the thick wooden doors. Her hands still trembled, fingers curled around Samson's leash as if it were a lifeline. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her not with judgment, but with something close to concern. "Miss Harper," he said gently, "tell me what just happened." Emily hesitated. No one had ever asked her that in a courtroom before, not in that tone. Most people either doubted her or tried to protect her from her own truth. But this judge, he wasn't looking at her like a broken witness. He looked like someone who wanted to listen. "I gave him a signal," she said quietly. "I've only had to use it twice before. Once during a panic attack, and once when I saw something that reminded me of my stepfather." She swallowed hard. "I saw his face," she added, voice cracking. "That look. That same smirk." The judge nodded slowly. "And the dog Samson is trained to respond to that?" "Yes, Your Honor. He's trained for trauma response. Not to attack, not to bark. Just to protect space between me and what's triggering me." The judge's eyes dropped briefly to Samson, who was sitting upright, still on guard. There was no aggression in his posture, only quiet vigilance. "Where did you get him?" Emily took a breath. "After I went into foster care, one of my counselors referred me to an organization called Healing Companions. They train service dogs for people who've survived abuse. I didn't talk to anyone for almost a year, not even my therapist. But when I met Samson, something changed." She looked down and smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. "He didn't need me to talk. He just stayed." The judge was silent for a moment. Then he motioned for the court clerk and asked her to summon Emily's therapist and caseworker into chambers. As they waited, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the years she had kept everything bottled up. The bruises explained away as clumsiness. The nightmares. The panic any time a door clicked shut. Her mother's silence. Her friend's confusion. Everyone had noticed something was wrong, but no one knew what to do. And she hadn't had the words to explain it. She remembered the first time she had seen the pamphlet about Healing Companions. A yellow dog, just like Samson, stood beside a girl who looked like she hadn't smiled in years. That girl had felt like a reflection. Now here she was, sitting in a courtroom, speaking to a judge who was giving her the floor instead of the lawyers. And beside her, the same yellow dog, real strong, steady. When the therapist entered, she quickly nodded toward Emily. The judge invited her to sit and asked, "Can you explain how this works?" The therapist nodded. "Samson is trained to recognize signs of trauma. But more than that, Emily and the dog have developed a system. She has a hand signal, simple, subtle. When she uses it, he knows she's in distress. It's a way to give her power when she feels powerless." The judge leaned back, clearly thinking, "Is this reliable?" "More than anything," the therapist replied. "Sometimes trauma victims freeze. They can't speak. The dog responds when the survivor can't." Silence settled again. The judge finally said, "This court has seen plenty of emotion, but I've never seen a dog act like an emotional interpreter." He turned to Emily. "I believe you." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. "I'd like to resume the hearing," the judge said, "but on one condition. Samson stays right there. You gave your signal once. You don't need to give it again." Samson didn't move. Emily smiled softly and nodded. And just like that, something invisible shifted not just in the courtroom, but inside Emily. For the first time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It felt like justice was finally learning how to listen. The courtroom buzzed quietly as people re-entered. The jury filed back into their seats. The judge had made it clear this trial would proceed with accommodations in place. Samson would remain by Emily's side for the remainder of her testimony. The defense had grumbled about emotional manipulation, but the judge's glare silenced any further complaints. Emily took a deep breath and returned to the witness stand. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she focused only on Samson, now lying beside the chair. His steady presence grounded her like an anchor in a storm. The prosecutor resumed gently. Emily, can you tell us what happened the night of November 14? Emily opened her mouth, but before she could answer, her gaze slipped again toward the defense table. There he was, her stepfather, leaning back, arms crossed, face calm, eyes cold. Then came the smirk. That same smirk he used to wear. Before closing her bedroom door. Before locking it, her voice caught in her throat. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, her hands trembling. The courtroom seemed to blur. For a moment, she wasn't in a courtroom. She was back in that small bedroom with the peeling pink wallpaper, the broken door latch, the quiet footsteps outside her room. Then reflexively, her fingers tapped her jeans. 2 quick touches, barely noticeable to the human eye, but not to Samson. The golden retriever's head lifted instantly. His ears perked. His body shifted. With quiet, deliberate motion, he stood, moved forward, and placed himself directly between Emily and her stepfather. Not aggressively, just there. Tall, protective, watchful, blocking Emily's view of the man she feared most. The room went completely still. Even the court reporter stopped typing for several long seconds. No one said a word. Then the defense attorney stood sharply. Objection. Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. The animal is influencing the jury. The judge raised a hand. Sit down, counselor. But sit down. Silence returned. The judge looked at Emily. Did you signal the dog again? She nodded slowly, eyes brimming with tears. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned to the courtroom. Let the record show. The dog's actions are a trained response to the witness's emotional distress. Not a trick, not a performance, and certainly not manipulation. He paused, looking around at the jury. This court will not punish a victim for having the courage to testify. Emily looked down at Samson. He sat, unmoving, facing the man who had haunted her for years. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. But somehow, his presence spoke louder than any outburst. He said, "She is not alone." After a few moments, the prosecutor softly continued, "Emily, take your time. There's no rush." She nodded, this time holding her head higher. I remember hearing the door open that night, she began, voice shaking but steady. And I remember exactly what was going to happen next, because it had already happened too many times. The words finally came, painful, raw, honest. She spoke not like a frightened child, but like someone who had fought to reclaim her voice. Every detail was clear. The room was silent except for her words and the occasional scribble of a juror's pen. Samson remained unmoving, her shield and her strength. By the time she finished, the jury didn't need convincing. They had seen the truth not only in her words, but in the body language of a dog who knew fear better than any human in that courtroom. As Emily stepped down from the stand, Samson followed her closely, never once breaking his watchful focus. And for the first time, she walked past her stepfather without looking away. She didn't need to anymore, because she wasn't walking alone. The courtroom was still recovering from what they'd just witnessed. Emily's words had painted a picture that was impossible to forget, and Samson's silent defense had touched something deeper in everyone present. Even the court bailiff, a stoic man with 20 years of experience, had been seen blinking away moisture from his eyes. But it was the judge who broke the silence. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked directly at Emily, who now sat beside her attorney. Samson rested at her feet, finally relaxed again, though his eyes never left the defense table. "Miss Harper," the judge said softly, "I have a question for you." Emily looked up, startled. The judge's voice was warm, personal, not the usual courtroom command. When you gave your dog that signal earlier, was it because you were in danger? Or because you were afraid? Emily hesitated. No one had ever asked her to define it like that. I think, she said slowly, it's both. He doesn't just respond to danger. He responds when I feel like I can't breathe, like I'm drowning. Even if no one sees it on the outside. The judge nodded, thoughtful. And has he ever been wrong? Never. The defense attorney stood again, trying to contain his frustration. Your Honor, with respect, we're straying far from the facts of the case. This is a trial, not a therapy session. The judge turned toward him calmly. You're mistaken, counselor. This is a trial involving a victim of long-term trauma. If we ignore the effects of that trauma while she's testifying, then we're not hearing the full truth. We're just hearing words. He turned back to Emily. Thank you for your honesty. And for your courage. Emily swallowed hard. Thank you for letting Samson stay. I believe you needed him more than we realized, the judge replied. Then he did something no one expected. He asked the jury to take a short recess, not just to review notes, but in his words, to reflect on what testimony really means when fear still lives in the room. As the jury left, the judge requested a private session. Emily, her attorney, the prosecutor, and the trauma therapist were invited into chambers. Samson came too, of course, padding softly beside her. Inside the judge's office, the atmosphere shifted from procedural to deeply personal. I've presided over hundreds of trials. The judge began, looking not at Emily, but at Samson. But I've never seen a witness as brave or as supported as you've been. He looked at the therapist next. Tell me everything about how this works. I need to understand it fully. The therapist explained Samson's training how he had been matched specifically to Emily after months of observation, how the hand signal was created as a communication tool for when fear made speaking impossible. She explained that Samson had detected changes in Emily's breathing, heart rate, even posture long before anyone else noticed. Animals don't lie, she said. They just react to what they sense. And what Samson sensed from Mr. Langston wasn't ordinary discomfort. It was danger. The judge nodded slowly. I've always believed the courtroom should be a place of truth. Today, I think I saw truth walk on four legs. Everyone was quiet. Emily looked down at Samson, who now rested calmly beside the chair. He saved me more times than anyone knows, she whispered. Not just today. The judge looked at her, then at Samson again. You both just changed the way I see testimony. As they returned to the courtroom, something felt different. The audience, the jury, even the court staff, they didn't just see a teenager and her dog anymore. They saw a team, a survivor and her shield, a girl who found a voice, and a judge who finally listened. As Emily returned to her seat, the courtroom felt transformed. The people who once stared with skepticism now watched with something closer to awe. Even the court clerk, who had seen years of painful testimonies, whispered to a colleague, "That girl isn't just strong. She's extraordinary." Samson lay quietly by Emily's feet again, his head resting on his paws. But even in rest, his presence spoke volumes. He wasn't just her comfort, he was her shield, her translator, her silent witness. The prosecutor stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Lillian Ross to the stand. Dr. Ross, Emily's trauma therapist, was composed and kind-eyed. She took the oath and began explaining the years-long process of Emily's recovery. How long it had taken her to talk, how deep the emotional wounds went, and how essential Samson had become to her healing. Emily doesn't always respond to verbal cues, Dr. Ross said. Her trauma responses are stored in the body. That's common in complex PTSD. When exposed to triggering environments, her body remembers before her words can catch up. And Samson? the prosecutor asked. He responds before she breaks. Down, Dr. Ross replied. That's why they developed the hand signal. It was a bridge away for Emily to say, "I'm not okay," when she couldn't speak those words out loud. The defense attorney stood. So you're saying the dog has intuition? No, Dr. Ross replied firmly. I'm saying the dog has training, precision, and experience. He's not guessing. He's protecting. The defense fell silent. Judge leaned forward again. So what happened earlier when the witness signaled the dog and he placed himself in front of the accused was a direct, trained response to trauma? Yes, Your Honor, and it was valid. The judge nodded. Then let it be recorded in the official transcript. The court recognizes the dog's role as an active part of the witness's testimony. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. This had never happened before, not like this. Emily looked down at Sampson, blinking fast to keep from crying. Not out of fear, but from something deeper. Relief. At the next recess, the judge requested another private meeting with Emily, her therapist, and her lawyer. They stepped into his chambers, where everything felt warmer, more human than before. I'll be honest, the judge said, folding his hands. I've been doing this for decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. But today changed something. For me. He looked directly at Emily. Do you know how many victims come in here, terrified, unable to speak? Too many. Most leave unheard. You found a way to speak when your voice was shaking. And when it couldn't speak, your dog did. Emily sat still, her cheeks flushed. I didn't think anyone would take it seriously, she admitted. People always act like therapy dogs are toys or distractions. The judge shook his head. Not today. Today he was a guardian. And so were you. Dr. Ross spoke softly. Emily is one of the first trauma survivors in this state to be allowed a PTSD response dog on the witness stand. But she shouldn't be the last. The judge leaned back in his chair. Agreed. I want to help change that. Everyone in the room went silent for a beat. You mean like new courtroom policies? Emily asked. Yes, the judge said. If more judges understood what I just saw today, more survivors could come forward and feel safe doing it. Emily smiled for the first time all day. Not the nervous smile she'd given before, but a real one. The kind that made her look less like a scared teenager and more like someone standing tall. As they left the chambers, Sampson walked beside her with quiet pride. The trial wasn't over, but a new path had started. One where silence no longer *** by Sia. The time Emily returned to the witness stand the next morning, something inside her had changed. The courtroom was the same. Her stepfather still sat at the defense table, but she wasn't the same girl who had walked in 2 days earlier, eyes lowered and shoulders tense. Now she sat straighter, steadier, not because the fear was gone, but because she had faced it and survived. Sampson lay at her side, quiet and poised. As always, his eyes never left her. The prosecutor stood again. Emily, are you ready to continue? She nodded. Yes. What followed was a testimony that would leave the courtroom stunned. Emily described years of abuse in horrifying detail. Every night she'd cried silently into her pillow. The locked doors, the whispered threats, the silence of the house that had once felt like home. She explained how she'd tried to tell her mother once, only to be called a liar. How she stopped trying after that. How it wasn't until she collapsed during a school fire drill that a counselor finally saw through her mask. The room was silent. Except for her voice. The defense attorney didn't dare interrupt. Even he knew the jury was listening with rapt attention, not just to her words, but to her body language, her pauses, her steadiness. There were no theatrics, no rehearsed emotion. Just a girl, telling the truth with a dog curled at her feet. holding the broken pieces of her story together. Sampson stirred only once when the defense mentioned false memories. Emily didn't flinch. Nothing about this was a memory. She said, "It was my life, every morning, every night, and I remember every second of it." When she stepped down from the witness stand, something remarkable happened. The courtroom rose, not on command, not for protocol, but out of unspoken respect. Even the jury members stood, their faces solemn. Emily paused mid-step, surprised. Then she caught the judge's eye. He gave her the smallest of nods. "You did it." Outside the courtroom during recess, reporters swarmed the hallway. Emily's lawyer blocked most of them, but one question slipped through. "How did you stay so calm up there?" Emily looked down at Sampson. "I wasn't alone." Inside, the trial moved swiftly. The defense called no witnesses. The weight of Emily's testimony had been undeniable. The prosecution rested its case, and the jury was sent to deliberate. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, the bailiff returned with a note. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone took their places once again. Emily sat beside her attorney, fingers clutching Sampson's collar. She didn't look at her stepfather. She didn't need to. The judge opened the envelope. On all charges, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled across the room. The court reporter paused for a beat before continuing her transcription. Emily closed her eyes, exhaling a breath that had been trapped in her chest for years. Her stepfather's expression was unreadable, but for once, he wasn't smirking. The judge called for order, but the room remained quiet, almost reverent. No one cheered. No one clapped. It was a silence filled with the weight of justice finally being served. After the verdict, the judge addressed the court with words no one expected. "I want to acknowledge the courage of this young woman. Her bravery, along with the guidance of her service animal, has reminded us that testimony isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's in the way we survive. Sometimes it walks into court on 4 legs and says more than words ever could." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she reached down to hug Sampson, who licked her cheek and wagged his tail. His job complete, his mission fulfilled. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not just because her abuser was going to prison, but because she had finally been believed. The courtroom was nearly empty now. Most of the press had cleared. The bailiff stood quietly near the exit, and the court clerk gathered papers from the judge's bench. Emily remained seated with Sampson curled at her feet, both of them still, processing what had just happened. The verdict had landed like thunder, but in its echo, there was a strange kind of peace. Her stepfather had been taken away in handcuffs without protest. Emily hadn't looked back once. Now, as the judge stood and removed his robe, he glanced down at her. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice quieter, more human, "would you mind stepping into chambers for just a few more minutes?" Emily looked at her attorney, who gave a gentle nod. She rose slowly. Sampson followed close, as always. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was less intimidating. Bookshelves lined the walls, and sunlight filtered in through tall windows. The judge motioned for her to sit, and she did, her posture still cautious, but more open now. "I wanted to speak with you off the record," he began, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "You've changed the way I see the courtroom." Emily looked surprised. The judge continued, "I've had hundreds of cases, seen every kind of testimony imaginable. But today was different. You didn't just speak, you educated all of us. And not just with your words, with your presence, with your dog." He smiled at Sampson, who thumped his tail gently in response. "I've always considered courtrooms to be a place for facts," the judge said. "But today I realized that facts alone don't equal truth. Truth lives in emotion, in body language, in fear that lingers. And sometimes Truth has four legs. Emily blinked back tears. I thought I was going to fall apart, she whispered. But he kept me steady. And you kept all of us awake, the judge replied. I planned to speak with the judicial board about creating a formal policy. Service animals like Samson should be permitted, not just allowed for trauma victims. Who testify? Her eyes widened. You mean like a law? Like a start, he said. A change. Emily looked down at Samson and placed a hand gently on his back. So, maybe no one else has to feel the way I did? That's the goal. The judge rose and walked to a bookshelf. He picked up a leather-bound notebook and opened to a blank page. Then he handed it to Emily. This is my personal courtroom journal. I only write in it after cases that matter. Would you mind writing something in here? Something for the next judge who doubts whether a dog belongs in court. Emily hesitated, then took the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, but her words came steady. Samson didn't just help me testify. He helped me survive. And today, he helped justice understand what survival really looks like. The judge read it, then closed the book with a soft nod. Perfect. As Emily and Samson prepared to leave, the judge added one more thing. I hope you'll keep telling your story. Not just here, but everywhere. I think I will. Emily said dot, and she meant it dot in the hallway outside. Her therapist and attorney waited with quiet smiles. Reporters stood behind barriers, cameras ready, but Emily didn't shy away. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding dot. As she walked past the crowd, someone asked, "What will you do next?" She didn't pause. I'm going to help. Other people feel safe enough to speak. And then she added, smiling down at Samson. With my partner, of course. He barked once, soft but certain, and the world was already listening. Months after the trial, Emily stood on a small stage in a community center, her golden retriever Samson lying quietly at her side. The room was filled with survivors of trauma, social workers, and curious students. The story of her courtroom bravery had spread far beyond the small Texas town where she lived. With a steady voice, Emily shared her journey, from silent suffering to standing strong, from fear to finding her voice. She spoke not only of the abuse she endured, but of the power of having someone or something by your side when words fail. Samson, calm and steady as ever, listened without judgment, occasionally nudging her hand with his nose. Sometimes, Emily said, the world doesn't want to hear the quiet parts of our stories. The parts where we freeze, or where we just can't speak. But having Samson helped me say what I couldn't say on my own. The crowd nodded, some wiping away tears. Social workers whispered to each other about how this could change the way trauma was handled in courts and schools. The story had become a beacon of hope. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, the judge had begun drafting new guidelines for service animals in courtrooms across the state. His proposal aimed to officially recognize service dogs like Samson as vital support for survivors during testimony, a small but powerful step toward compassionate justice. Emily's case became a catalyst. Local news stations ran interviews. Nonprofits raised funds to train more trauma dogs, and legislators took note. Other survivors came forward, encouraged by Emily's courage and Samson's silent testimony. But for Emily, the biggest change was personal. No longer was she the frightened girl who entered that courtroom months ago. She was an advocate now, speaking at schools, conferences, and support groups. She partnered with a nonprofit that trained Samson, helping match other survivors with service dogs. Samson, her faithful companion, earned a medal from the local police department for his role in the case, an honor both proud and poignant. One quiet afternoon, Emily walked through the park with Samson, watching children play and dogs chase frisbees. A little girl approached, holding a flyer about service dogs. Is your dog special? she asked. Emily smiled, kneeling down. He's my hero, the girl grinned. I want a hero too. Emily squeezed Samson's leash. You will. That night, as the sun set, Emily sat quietly at home. She ran her fingers through Samson's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with possibility. Together, they had faced fear, found justice, and sparked change. One small signal had echoed far beyond the courtroom walls, reminding the world that sometimes healing walks on four legs. And Emily knew no matter what came next, she would never be silent again.